Good evening. Is there anyone that was not here last week and did not get one of the sheets I passed out on power and authority? Okay. Anna Faye, what's our first song? Let's sing. What number is that? 2051. In the small black books, 2051. I was there to hear your morning cry. I want to give just a little bit more background to what it is we're doing. In 2019, after General Conference met, in that fall, Mosaic met and talked about all that had been going on and basically said that at the next General Conference, if the Methodist Church did not become really an LGBTQ affirming denomination, our desire was going to be to leave the denomination. And we thought that General Conference was going to meet that next year. And so there was a lot of stuff kind of going on globally with the church, including bishops who said, we will not, if charges are brought against somebody, we won't work on that right now. We're going to kind of wait till General Conference and see what happens. But since General Conference did not meet due to COVID, there's a lot of things that are somewhat uncertain. If charges were brought against a pastor, for example, for performing a wedding, there's just no one knows what might happen. And there is a campus minister who's a pastor on the somewhere in the southeast who has had charges brought against him, and they have not resolved those. And it's been going on for many months, and really too many months. And so it's left that pastor in limbo, not knowing about their future. And we're not really for sure if General Conference will meet next year or not. My guess is we will not. Only 2% of people in Africa have been vaccinated. They're not coming into this country. And 40% of the delegates are from Europe and Africa and the Philippines. And so the question really is going to be, can we have something online? And that's really, other denominations have done that, but other denominations who've done that are US-based. So there's only, from Maine to Hawaii I don't know, is that 5 or 6 time zones? I don't know. For us, from, Russia all the way to the Philippines, that's a lot of time zones and a lot of uncertainty about internet connectivity in some places. So this leaves us sort of in this waiting period. And I certainly do not want to bring this up every single week. And so we haven't brought it up, especially during COVID. But I do want you to know that the council does talk about it frequently, not every meeting, but it does come up. And we had asked the conference, what would we owe if we want to leave? Because we have to pay our pension obligation for the clergy's pension. And there's also 9 other items that they look at for finances that might have an impact on a local church. Normally, it's very difficult for churches to leave primarily because of the trust clause, meaning that we are not in charge of our own property in every single facet. If we want to build, you get permission from the district, and if you want to move locations, you've got to get permission. And technically, we own the property in trust for the annual conference. So it means we're not congregational. We are a connectional church in which other denominations also have this. The Episcopalians, the Presbyterians, and they've struggled a little bit as they have divided as well. What we wanted to avoid is paying the lawyers a lot of money if we fight over property, which is what's happened to the Episcopalians, certainly. And so in 2019, General Conference put into the discipline a way for churches to leave with their property without having to necessarily pay for the property, for example. You could take the property with you. But there are these other obligations we have to look at, one of them being the pension obligation that we would owe for our retired clergy and their spouses. So I'm not ready tonight to share that information with you, but maybe soon we'll be able to do that so you'll know exactly what the council's looking at. But I will also say that there are some churches and pastors and lay people who've already left. And I don't know how to find out this information except, I guess, to look at all each annual conference's journal, if it's online. From the newspapers or from social media, I'm aware of a handful of conservative churches that have led to other annual conferences. And I'm aware of reconciling churches that have left in other annual conferences. No one has left under these rules in Oklahoma, but according to one source I saw this week, 51 churches left last calendar year. We don't exactly publicize that kind of stuff. I think that stuff it doesn't make the headlines necessarily in the church world, and the non-church world doesn't really care that much. So I was not aware 51 churches had left. Some of those could have been not over this. Some of it could have just been a tiny church in a small community, and they just became like a community church. Those kind of things happen. So I don't know the status of all 51 of those churches. But I will tell you this, that some of my colleagues have just left. People who've been at the RMN combos and people who've been working for change. Every year, people sort of drop off. And Monica and others can tell you that especially in a general conference year, people get upset and angry and then they leave, right? And they get tired and they leave. A lot of people have left since 2019. And of course, there is a group that says they're kind of starting a progressive Methodist denomination. And that is not really going far fast, but maybe it will later. We don't know. Then there's the conservative side that say, well, we're going to put together this global Methodist church. And they are working much harder and have their plans in place to, at any moment they could make that happen. But they're also waiting on General Conference. Now, there are a lot of people who say, we should not leave the United Methodist Church. So there's lots of groups out there that really their primary purpose is to really sort of convince people, don't abandon the ship, right? Don't abandon the ship. So, and I get told that because people across Oklahoma know that we have been strongly considering leaving. And so people will reach out either sort of on purpose, or it'll just be if I happen to see them, right? Oh, don't leave, don't leave. But across the global church, there are people that's their purpose, and there's a group like in the southeast of Eastern United States that has a website, Stay UMC. So everything they post is sort of to make sure that you have the facts that you don't want to leave the UMC. So if that was what I heard Mosaic saying, our conversations might be very different right now. But when we had that meeting in November of 2019, the overwhelmingly majority of our people said, if things don't change, we think it would be time to leave. So that's sort of been how I have approached this. And I have been a United Methodist my whole life, and so of course I know the pluses and the minuses, the pros and the cons. I have not seen it to be my purpose as the pastor to convince Mosaic, A, what to do, or to stay UMC. That's not been my purpose, primarily because it was like a 98% straw vote on the straw poll, sort of like, yes, we would be ready to leave if things don't change. Now, so the ones who are saying stay, for the most part, they want change, but they just think we can stay and still have change happen. And I respect that 100%. So, so we've been looking at the UCC primarily because it is the one denomination that I would feel probably most comfortable in switching to it. Oh, now I remember what I wanted to say a minute ago was that the council did reach out to the UCC to ask questions and to find out about their denomination and about if Mosaic were to seek to become UCC, what would be the, what would we need to do to make that happen, right? Is that even a possibility? And the overwhelmingly, the response that we got was, we would welcome you, but it is not our desire to take you away from the United Methodist denomination. We would hope that things would change, that you could stay. It was very clear to me that they did not see themselves, stealing us from the United Methodist denomination. So looking in 2 weeks, we will look at other denominations. And I am totally open to talking about any denominations we want to talk about, but the reason we're doing UCC is because it's the one that stands out to me that we would most easily become, not that we would easily become one, but it would be closest to who we already are as a local congregation, in other words. So in that sense, if we stepped out of the Methodist Church into the UCC, I don't think we would feel any differently as a local church. And in fact, we asked the question, what would we have to change in the way we do things at Mosaic? And quite honestly, and I think it was an honest answer, the person said, we can't think of anything that we would necessarily say, like that you have to change this. In other words, they would not be coming in here saying, oh, we see you still have Methodist hymnals in your pews. You've got to really buy our hymnals to show your loyalty. That's not who they are. That's just not who they are. So they're not going to do that. But that's just one example that I could think of the top of my head, where like if we still thought a lot of John Wesley and the Wesleyan way of viewing the spiritual life, we were just told that is A-okay with us. Now I think we've picked up on from these videos, right, and that makes sense because they have said it isn't important for us that you sign your name to a certain creed, right? They have said that your testimony of faith is more important than a statement of faith that is like a creed that you would have to sign your name to say, this is what we believe, right? 1, 2, 3, ABC. And so that makes sense. And I think that probably there are some UCC churches, based upon the study I did and that Jenny did, that would probably feel really tied to their historical roots. And I think that when I was going to an Episcopal church in seminary, what I realized was there was a lot of ties to England and sort of, English things. And I thought, Methodist also came out of England, but when I'm in any Methodist church, I don't feel that strong connection to England. But in the Episcopal church, it seemed to me, and this was 20-some years ago, so don't hold me to that now in terms of my view. But at the time, I thought that I would have to kind of take on sort of an English, right, manner, thinking and looking at their heroes, or maybe I wouldn't be truly an Episcopalian, right? Now, I think that's probably not really true, but there is a sense in that if you are in an Episcopal church long, that they very much hold those ties much more closely than we Methodists do. We just don't think of ourselves. I mean, we talk about, oh, we came out of England, but it isn't that we have nothing in this church to, or in our liturgy that, reminds us of that, right? So I think in terms of where we, putting on a glove, which one would fit the best? Well, in my mind, UCC. Although the disciples is probably a close second. And so in 3 weeks, we'll have Paul Culkin, who's the pastor of Mayfair Heights. He was a disciples pastor. And also we'll have Shannon Fleck, who is a disciples pastor, but the director of Oklahoma Conference of Churches. And they'll be here to talk about the disciples, and then we can ask them questions as well. So I wanted to give that little bit of a background, and I know sometimes I repeat myself, but I also know the more you hear it, then the more it'll click, and you'll think, this is really important, right? This is why Scott's saying this. Tonight we're talking about ethos, what is the character of the UCC? What's the DNA? We talk about Mosaic sometimes as what is our DNA. Ethos is the character and sort of the DNA. And the first thing we're going to talk about tonight is power and authority. There's 2 videos. And the second video is about the future of the UCC as they sort of look to their purpose, mission, vision, and strategic vision. Aren't long videos, and I've got another handout I'll give you also after we see the videos. But let's watch the first video, then we'll discuss it.
I was invited here to talk about authority in the United Church of Christ. And one of the key references for us in our denomination is the preamble to our Constitution, which says that the United Church of Christ acknowledges its sole head is Jesus Christ, Son of God and Savior, and acknowledges kindred in spirit, all who share in this confession. It looks to the Word of God in Scripture and to the presence and power of the Holy Spirit to prosper its creative and redemptive work in the world. And it claims as its own the faith of the historic church expressed in ancient creeds and reclaimed in the basic insights of the Protestant reformers. It affirms the responsibility of the church in each generation to make this faith its own in the reality of worship, in honesty in thought and expression, and in purity of heart before God, in accordance with the teachings of our Lord and the practices prevailing among evangelical Christians. And it recognizes 2 sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper or Holy Communion. This is probably one of the most clear statements on authority that the United Church of Christ has. Although we come from a variety of streams of traditions, some very old and some much newer, we find that we practice what John Wesley would call the quadrilateral of authority, where we look to Scripture as authoritative in our work, we look to reason and to experience and tradition. And depending on what stream of the United Church of Christ your congregation comes from, you may rely more heavily on one of those 4 than another, but those 4 all influence our understandings of authority in the United Church of Christ. The word authority has the same Latin root as the word autonomy. And we tend to think in the United Church of Christ about our local congregations as having local authority or autonomy. And so our local congregations have the opportunity to create their own styles of worship, to call together their own forms of governance, to call their own pastoral leadership, and to create their own individual constitutions and bylaws. The same is true for individuals who are authored by God and blessed by God in the rite of baptism. Together, both local churches and individuals, even though they are indeed autonomous and have, in some respects, individual authority in the United Church of Christ, are asked to come together in covenant so that we share equally in the responsibilities of responding faithfully to Christ's work and mission in the world. When we think about ways in which decisions are made and authority is shaped in the United Church of Christ, we do not have a hierarchical structure with bishops that may be present in other types of Protestant denominations. Instead, our Constitution and bylaws gives a great deal of authority to our associations. Our associations serve as our episcopae, and in most places, those decisions and the episcopae are made real by committees on ministry, which are groups of individuals that are both authorized ministers and lay leaders in our church, who come together to make very important decisions in and on behalf of the entire United Church of Christ. Two of those decisions, one is about receiving new churches in standing as congregations of the United Church of Christ. And those same groups of people, the committees on ministry, are the groups who make the determinations for authorization for ministry of individuals who are called to serve both God and the church. And the interesting thing is that many of our associations and our committees on ministry use what are called ecclesiastical councils to make those final decisions on ministerial authorization. And those ecclesiastical councils are invitations for the wider church to gather in that particular region or geographic area to be able to come together in prayer and in discernment to make those decisions. And again, those decisions serve in and on behalf of the entire denomination. This is very different from the authority granted to some of our larger bodies, such as our General Synod or our United Church Board of Directors, which serves as our General Synod ad interim. When General Synod or the Board of Directors make decisions, such as resolutions or statements of witness, those are deemed to be items for the church to discuss. They are not representative of the church. And so there's a difference in the types of decisions and the authority of those decisions within different settings of our structure. But in all of this, authority in the United Church of Christ is shared in covenant. It is authority that is replicating the covenantal relationship of God between Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, and the triune nature, that it is shared in a multiplicity of ways through our covenantal relationships with one another. Authority is not vested in any one person or any one setting or any one office of the church, but it is the responsibility of all baptized Christians to share in the authorship that God has given us by virtue of our baptism and our call to be in community together. And we do so through local churches, in relationship with associations and then conferences, and the wider settings of the church. So that way, we have an opportunity to look for ways in which God is moving and prompting and encouraging us, not just to discern, but to make decisions that will help to strengthen God's mission in the United Church of Christ.
So you may have some questions, but I want to sort of summarize a couple of things that she said that we've talked about before. And that is that in the United Methodist Church, we also have different settings. That's the word that the UCC uses, settings. And there's 4 settings that the UCC sort of focuses on. There's a local church, then there's the association, then there's the conference, then there is the wider church, which would really be sort of like their national kind of level, maybe. See, I use the word level, and they would say, no, we don't have levels, because level implies a hierarchy. So we talk about, in the United Methodist Church, we have the local church, we've got the district. The district superintendent has a lot of authority over a local church. We're going to get ready to elect a delegate to go to annual conference that is an extra delegate that we would have, because in the Methodist Church, there has to be an equal number of clergy and laity at annual conference and general conference. So there must be more clergy right now in Oklahoma. So we're in the past, district superintendents oftentimes, Kathy, you can verify this, they would sometimes sort of choose people to be those delegates. A lot of times they look for young adults or youth, and the DS often would do that. This year, they're asking this to be much more, local churches have to nominate someone, and the local church has to have a charge conference meeting to affirm that person. Well, that only happens with the permission of the district superintendent. So the district superintendent will either come and hold that meeting or authorize another elder to have that meeting, and then we will elect a delegate. So that's a kind of a level of authority that, and a hierarchy to our denomination. Then the annual conference. The annual conference has a lot of power, and I'm not using these words negatively, but power or influence over pastors, and they hold pastors accountable to a lot of things. And when our general conference votes on something, that is the law. And if they make a statement about baptism, or they make a statement about homeschooling, or they make a statement about nuclear weapons, or they make a statement about LGBTQ marriages, that becomes the law of the church. And so we oftentimes when people are interviewed, you'll hear bishops say this a lot. All I can really tell you is what General Conference has said. I can't tell you like what I believe, or because what I believe in this instance doesn't matter if you're asking me what the United Methodist Church teaches, right? What did she say, though, there at the end of the video about when they have their synod? What did she call that? They have the local church, that's one setting. Then they have associations, which I would sort of equate to our districts. Then they have a conference, which I would equate to our annual conference. And then they have the synod. And you'll oftentimes hear them saying the wider church, and that just means the agencies and whatnot that they support, right? So what did she say there about when they have resolutions at their general synod? Did you catch that? You weren't, see, so she says when they vote on a statement, those are statements to the church to consider, and I think they also talk about them being to the world to consider, but I think the difference between us and them, when our general conference votes on a resolution, that becomes the law. They, at their national setting, may vote to say, we affirm same-sex marriage. But that doesn't become the law. Why? Because the local church in their setting is congregational. And you heard her talk about that. The local church decides who their pastor is going to be, what their worship's like, what their leadership structure is like. So they can't make a rule that applies to all the churches. So what that really means is you can say, well, as a denomination, this is what they've said. But a local church can say, well, we don't agree with that. That's and the same is true in a Methodist church in terms of individuals can say, we don't agree with that. The difference is that the level of accountability that a bishop or a district superintendent may have over a pastor or a church in terms of some rules that are enforced, right? So that's a key difference. So they would say, whatever we have voted on, it's a message that we send back to the churches to consider, but it's not law. And so she talked about authority, but she also talked about covenant, right? She talked about authority being in the individuals, but also in the local church. Each setting, local church, association like a district, or a conference like an annual conference, the global church, or the synod like maybe our general conference, each one of those has a certain authority over certain areas, but they also work together in the idea of mutual accountability and a covenant, which also sounds to me very idealistic, but we as Methodists are also idealistic about some things. So it's not that they're just the only ones idealistic, but that does sound to me like a very idealistic kind of so a local church can call their pastor, but it's also from a pool of people that have received standing. So just like our Methodist churches, our pastors are also vetted, right? They're vetted through the local church, which puts someone forward. Like we've said, we support Jonathan, but Jonathan now meets with the district committee, and they have to get to know him and interview him and put him through the hoops. And then he will one day, hopefully, go on to the annual conference, Board of Ordained Ministry. Well, she was talking about the Commission on Ministry, I think, or the COM. That would be almost identical to like our Board of Ordained Ministry in terms of saying they interview the people and they say, yes, we see in you the gifts and graces to be a pastor. And they ask the questions, what do you believe about God, blah, blah, blah. And, you've done your psychological testing and blah, blah, blah. And then they give their stamp of approval. So even though these local churches are picking their own pastors, which we talked about last week, they have been vetted in a different setting that has the power and authority to do that, but in a covenant relationship. So that's how that works. So what questions did you have just from that video itself, or anything?
I'm not sure when you say in a covenant relationship. So like, say a church didn't like the way that the Commission on Ministry, whoever it is, that if they didn't agree with the decision to judge somebody positively or negatively or not, what happens then?
Do you mean about if they didn't approve someone to be a pastor?
Right, or they did. I mean, like, how does that covenant relationship work?
Well, that is something we could actually very much ask Lori Walkie, and Lisa Wolf's going to be with us next week. And they would probably know much more about the nuts and bolts of that than I would. So don't forget that question. There is this one I passed out, and I'll make these available again, specifically on covenant, that I passed out in a previous week. And to be honest, Becky, I don't know exactly the question, how to answer that, but I think that Lisa Wolf certainly and Lori Walkie will give us the nuts and bolts of that. I'm just not as knowledgeable about that because that's really kind of a deeper thing that they have spoken about so much more, and I don't really have an answer to that. Yeah, I just know that that's what they stress, is that we're in a covenant with each other. So, but that is a good question. Yeah. Anything else? Because really, other than that question about a pastor, I can't think of necessarily that much that if you're going to talk about being congregational, I can't think of much that would be at stake other than, if that's what you're asking me, in terms of the pastor, right? Now, she said they also do one other thing. Oh, they are the ones who they're the group we would go before if we wanted to be received as a church. So that would be one of the things that group also does, not just giving pastors a stamp of approval, but if they're going to receive a church into their denomination, yeah, that's the same group. So, other questions? Well, so the question is, what hoops do I need to jump through? And I probably need to be asking that question. I do know that I took the class because I knew there would be an educational aspect. And that was history of the UCC, the theology and the polity of the class. I think it's a matter of meeting with that committee and probably doing some written work. They're probably going to have some questions, about my beliefs, and probably an interview, and probably background check, and maybe psychological. I don't know if, since I'm already ordained in the United Methodist system, how much of that they would require, in terms of the psychological testing or a background check. But I know certainly we can ask David Wheeler that as well, because he switched from the Methodist to the UCC. And I know someone else that switched, and I don't think it was that terribly difficult because they were already ordained, in the United Methodist Church. So, So the question is, if I were to become UCC, then is that just a clean break with the United Methodist Church? It could be. Is that what you're asking? So I think it could be. Now, so let me just throw this out here. I do want us to watch one more video, but it's a short video. So let me throw this out there, because I was planning on doing this tonight anyway. I think it's in Austin. I forget the name of the church. What, Trinity, is that right? So there's Trinity Church in Austin. It's United Methodist Church. It was reconciling. Sid Hall was their pastor for, I think, a couple decades. I think he was there a couple decades. They had joint standing. They sought joint standing with the UCC, and then also to remain connected to the Methodist Church. I believe that he had joint standing as a clergy person with both churches. Our council also talked to him, and I do not remember really what that meant in terms of him doing weddings, because if he had standing in both, he's still a Methodist, right? So I don't know. He just retired this year, so he doesn't care now, right? But I would like to throw out there, the council has heard this from me. So this happens a lot in smaller towns, but there are different categories of churches that, like where my parents grew up, it's a very small town and it's dying, and those churches have decreased significantly in 50 years, right? Just significantly. And people always say, why don't they just become one church, right? And the Methodist Church has steps up and steps down, and everybody's getting older, and they're both like, the Christian church has single digit now, Methodist Church, 20 or less probably, I think. And why don't they get together, right? Well, they could, and sometimes in those happen in different configurations. So if two churches of two different denominations, they could get together and become what's called a federated church, which would mean that the membership roles, they would have two membership roles. Or maybe it's three churches, they have three roles. And people would say, well, I want to be on the Methodist role, I want to be on this role. And there's a church like that in Weatherford, for example, and David Wheeler is going to be here to talk to our council and Mayfair Heights Council. I'll probably just open that up to everybody to talk about how that works. What do the nuts and bolts of that look like? If we could have this property and have it in the name of another denomination, then we could do weddings here. And if Mayfair Heights wasn't ready, let's say they want to remain as United Methodist Church, so they could give us the building, and they could still be a congregation, but we could actually seek, and if that happens, we would just let them continue to be here, right? And that would just be like them having us here. That's just the same thing, only reversed, right? But we could seek to say, well, let's become a federated church, because maybe they don't want to give up being Methodist yet. And there may be some of us that don't want to give up being Methodist. So we could become one church, but we could relate to the Methodists and whatever Mosaic wants to become. And people of both churches could say, well, here's the role I want to be on. And I think the apportionments would be determined by that role. So let's say that we have 25 people who are on the Methodist role, but then we have 150 people on a different role. We might still have to pay apportionments, but that would be based on the 25 people and not the whole congregation.
No, it's not based on membership. It's based on budget.
But I mean the percentage, I think. Wouldn't it be it wouldn't be our whole budget, it'd be a percentage, right? Wouldn't it be? I don't know. I think what I've been told, you're right, our apportionments are not based on membership, but I think we'll have to ask that question. And Tish Malloy could help us with that. Because two churches in her, the issue is that people for years have thought, well, our apportionments are based on membership, and that's not true for Oklahoma. People get nervous because they say, we've got 1,000 people on our roll, but only 200 people come, right? But our apportionments are based on our budget, what we spend. But I think that they would look at, if 25% of our church was on the Methodist roll, then the apportionment wouldn't be a full 100%. I think it's based on, I think they look at, well, your church is 25 and 75. But we'll have to ask Tish about that. I could be totally wrong about that, and we'll have to ask Tish about that. Because she led two churches in her district to do this, and her role now is to help churches who are doing this kind of stuff. So that's a good question we need to ask. But I think what I'm saying, though, is we would not be assessed a whole 100% if 3/4 of our church wasn't United Methodist. That's the point. So thank you for that. So I think that what would that look like? It means we would be one church, but we would also relate to two denominations. And I think what it means is every individual would choose where they put their membership. So this is obviously something that Mosaic needs to think about, the Mayfair Heights has to think about, and I think we have to get permission from the Methodists to do that, and permission from the UCC. So you can see there's lots of steps, because we would need to be received as a UCC church, or whatever we want to do. But then we'd have to get both denominations to agree that we could become a federated church. Well, if Sid Hall did it in Austin, I think we could do it in Oklahoma City. And what's the positive of that? Well, there may be some people who just aren't ready to give up being United Methodist. So that's one so we wouldn't lose anybody if they say, well, if you leave, I think I'll have to go to another church and I can't stay with Mosaic. So we wouldn't lose anybody necessarily, right? The other thing is like, our people, they understand our rules, and for the most part, right, they understand we're working to change the rules. But as we bring in new people, even in the past 6 years, this has been difficult. We had someone that came, and when we had a membership class, Q&A, it was just a Q&A. And we talked about the rules. They never came back. Well, that's not surprising. They did not come back. So that's the tricky part for us is, how do you attract new people and get them to want to come and be a part of it if they can go to not any other church, but a lot of other churches today, which their pastor will marry you, and it's not that big of a deal, and we're still fighting that battle. So that's part of the issue of where we are. And that's what I meant in the very beginning when I said, some people are just saying, stay UMC no matter what, don't leave, And then some people are like, we're just so tired of fighting this fight, it's time to leave. So, but if we keep one foot in the Methodist Church, we could continue to work for change, right? And in my mind, right? Yeah.
So, as I understand it, in the United Methodist Church right now, there is the global church, or that subgroup, or whatever.
The Global Methodist Church, which is not official yet, but
Not official, but who are primed to
leave, yes.
And then if they do that, then that leaves basically people who are not conservatives, right?
Okay, so in theory, maybe. Keep going, and I'll answer that.
I'm just wondering what you see happening
Okay.
with the remainder of the.
So the question is, if these conservatives who are wanting to start this Global Methodist Church do leave, then who's left and what may happen? Is that what you're asking? So many people believe that if those people would leave, then they would not have that influence anymore, and they wouldn't have that influence at General Conference, and that we could then vote and become an affirming denomination. And last year, in 2019, when we elected people who we thought was the regularly scheduled General Conference in 2020, that was the normal time to have that. Across the U.S., for the most part, many more centrists and liberals got elected than they had in the past. So people were sort of really upset about St. Louis and said, by golly, we got to vote some new people in. So the thought is, if these conservatives would leave, then we would have the votes. Okay, so here's the issues. A lot of people don't want to leave, really. 30% of the delegates are from Africa, and many of them are saying, we like the United Methodist Church, we're not going to go with the Global Methodist Church. So let's say that they don't leave. Then we still have their votes and their influence, right? And there's also a lot of people who are sort of saying, some of the people who are more centrist or in the middle, they keep saying, we like having a church with liberals and conservatives and centrists. Well, okay, are you straight or are you LGBT? Who's saying that? A straight white guy who has privilege? And one of the people who said that, I saw that just this week, and I was like, yeah, you're white, you're a male, and you're straight. Okay, that's easy for you to say. Because if all those people stay, then are we going to keep fighting over this issue? Right? That's the question. So to answer your question is, I don't know, and I do not want to play the guessing game. Because when we went to St. Louis, a lot of folks just said there is absolutely no way the traditionalist plan will ever pass. It is way too, it's not like Methodist. It doesn't sound like us. It's never going to pass. Well, yes, it passed. And people who are the people who try to keep track of all of that, I get phone calls or emails that say, we know you have, what do we have, 7 clergy and then 7 alternates, so we have 14 clergy. Is that right, Kathy? Out of these 14 clergy, you tell me who's liberal, who's conservative, who's middle of the road. Because they're trying to figure it, and they say, how do you think they're going to vote? They're trying to tally up the votes. And people said to me, we have the votes, meaning those of us who are more liberal who want to change, we have the votes. Well, we were there. Were you there? No, you weren't there. I was there. It was devastating because the traditionalists had the votes. And so that's why a lot of people have left, is because they're tired of that. They're like, it's excruciating, it's painful. So that's why a lot of those people who have gone to General Conference, they leave because they get tired and they're sick and tired. And so I've just said to people, don't ask me to guess because I just do not know. Some people have said, if we were to split, the next day we could vote in new stuff, but that's just someone guessing. We don't know. Would we have to wait 4 more years? Would we have to wait 8 more years? That's what people have been saying. Well, we may have to wait 4 more years. So the question is not just, well, right now we're waiting to see if we're going to meet next year. And if we don't meet next year, they basically have said, we're not going to meet in 2023. So we're going to meet in 2024. So if they don't meet next year, we've got to wait 2 more years. Then are we going to wait 4 more years? I mean, it's kind of like Congress, right? They pass these bills, and we don't even know what's in those bills sometimes, right? I mean, that's just the way it works, right? Or things get changed at the last minute. That's, amendments. And that's why we don't know, Becky. We don't know. So the way we work is we have the Judicial Council, which is like our Supreme Court, and that just means that every step of the way, they have the voice and the power and authority to say, what you passed, it's constitutional according to the Methodist Constitution, or it's not constitutional. And like in 2012, they passed major changes in terms of our structure. And at the last day, Judicial Council said, this is all unconstitutional. And everybody said that was a worthless meeting, that we spent 2 weeks and $20 million and it was worthless. So, which is why now people try to get the Judicial Council to rule beforehand, which they say, well, we also can't rule on things that are theoretical, right? We can't rule, Yeah, we can't give you an opinion on something it has to pass first, right? Before we can rule on it. So that's the issue. Let's watch this video on the future of the UCC. Great questions. Lori Walkie, pastor of Mayflower, and Lori Wolf goes to Open Arms. She's ordained. She teaches at OCU. And she grew up Methodist, actually. Lisa Wolf did. So they will be here, and we can ask them all these hard questions, okay? Let's watch the second video.
In the values of our denomination from the start, and I say denomination meaning since 1957, we wrote into our charter, our bylaws and all of that each generation will take this message and make it our own. We wrote in that we were going to be interactive with a still speaking God, as we've reinterpreted it along the way in such a way that we continue to make this a relevant message of hope for all that is to come. So I had the deep blessing to chair the strategic vision for the denomination moving forward. And I had an opportunity to really listen to people under 40 about what the future transformative church can look like. And we learned so much. And at the same time we were doing that work, that we were doing other work to figure out and ask the questions and own the questions more than ask them about why are we here, what's our purpose, and who are we, what do we vision for what we're to do together. When the Reverend Dr. John Dorhauer stepped into the role of general minister and president, he was intentional to listen and to ask particularly people under 40, what does a relevant UCC look like in 10 years? And that's the question that we were tasked with, this group of 9 of us, to answer that question in any way that we really could. So before going into methodology, we heard the question and we said, nay. That is a question a dying institution asks, is how do we remain relevant? But for me, as I look to, for me and for the people in that room at that time, as we look to 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 more years of ordained ministry in front of us, we wanted to know instead, what does a transformative church look like in 10 years? How can we be the church that we need to be in order to hold the fullness of the gospel in this context? It's with joy and hope and intention that I want to invite you into our purpose, mission, and vision as the United Church of Christ for who we can be in the world becoming. So the purpose of the United Church of Christ is to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves. The mission of the United Church of Christ is united in spirit and inspired by God's grace. We welcome all, love all, and seek justice for all. And the vision of the United Church of Christ, that which we are aspiring to together, is that we are united in Christ's love. We vision a just world for all. And that all, what I take from that is that all really means all. It's not just those who are disenfranchised from church. It's not just all that is beyond our walls. It's the nuns and the duns and the those who are on the margins and the margins of the margins. It's the bodies that are in constant danger as a result of who they are and how they love. It's those who we know and those who we have yet to know. And part of building that just world and part of the United Church of Christ is that we have this opportunity to live into that. In addition to working with the mission, vision, and purpose of the United Church of Christ, we wondered, what would it be like for this church to be a transformative church in 10 years? So we ran this national study asking only folk under 40, not because we don't care about what folk over 40 think, but because we have this missing constituency for what we were visioning. So we asked them, what does a transformative church look like in 10 years? And after running focus groups, interviews, and a survey that got more response than any other survey the UCC has ever done, we put together this vision statement for what that can be. And that is that we are focused and hoping for Christ-driven connection. Striving to imitate the life of Christ, the transformative United Church of Christ will encourage authentic connection and compassion between individuals, local communities, and the world, using creative, agile technologies and partnerships. God-centered action. In 10 years, the UCC will be committed to building deep partnerships in communities that produce collective social action. We will boldly and actively endeavor to bring justice for all. We will be invitational as well as self-reflective, engaging the internal work of welcoming radical difference and truth-telling against systems of oppression that have held God's beloved people captive. And spirit-led leadership. In 10 years, the transformative United Church of Christ will be an innovative, nimble, and credible source of institutional support, moving with spirit and intention, able to vision courageously and respond swiftly to and for the communities and world in which we live for the sake of the gospel. Our vision for what the UCC can be and our attentiveness to why we're here now give me hope for how this institution, with all of the rules that we have made for ourselves, can continue to be a viable source of hope for a world that desperately needs hope, for faith for a world that desperately needs faith, and love for a world that sometimes has forgotten how to love. That the church can be the place where we teach these values again, where we embody them in all that we do, where we invite and encourage people to connect with each other across radical difference for a hope of a kingdom that is not here yet. Because ultimately, everything that we're doing is in partnership with God, hoping for something that we will not see the end of, and working for something with faith that all that has come before and all that will come thereafter is for a greater purpose that we don't know all the answers to, but our work in the process is valuable and worthy and attentive for what we have to do together for the sake of the gospel.
We have run out of time, but the sheet at the back, toward the 21st century, I think this is a good statement, but I also realized it was written in 93. And that seems, I mean, when I was working with college students, if it was 5 years old, it was way too old. But I think this is real well written, and I think it probably still describes who the UCC sees themselves as. But thank you all so much for your questions, and again, I will send out some summary stuff tonight, like I have been doing, and I'm also going to send that out. I've been sending that out through my own personal sort of email list and not the church email list, but I'm going to send out a whole summary of the whole 5 weeks to the entire church, because I think some people who are on that mailing list haven't gotten the information. And these videos are also on YouTube, and I'm going to clearly mark it as the UCC playlist, and so there's 5 of those you can watch. Next week, Lori will be with us, and Lisa. The week after, we'll talk some about Lutherans and Presbyterians and Episcopalians, and then the week after, Paul and Shannon will be with us. So that's as far as I've been able to plan, and we'll see what happens after that. People do want to know, like, well, when are we going to make a decision? Well, I think, this is my own personal opinion, that when we find out if General Conference is going to meet next year, that would be the time for us to say, well, now we need to make another decision. Because if they're not going to meet, we need to decide, do we want to leave and take our property? Because the timeline to do that is going to run out. That's not an open-ended thing. There's a deadline to do that. And so if they don't meet till 2024, then we will miss that deadline. So we have to decide, then do we want to stay? Do we want to go ahead and leave? And I think I'll talk more about this federated church idea, because I think it really may be a win-win for Mosaic and for Mayfair Heights and for our future. So I'll talk more about that as well. So we want to sing a song real quick.